The Titanic carried 3,300 passengers and crew. Nearly half of them lost their lives on the night of April 14, 1912. But the stories of the Titanic live on. On the ship were millionaires, artists, fashionistas, bakers, cookers, musicians, doctors, and con men. These are their stories. Welcome to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. Hi everyone, welcome back to our series on the last night of the Titanic. We've looked at many different people who were there when the ship went down. People who helped those get into lifeboats, trendsetters, bakers, different types of service personnel. Now we're going to look at a group of people that are probably part of any large event, and that's doctors. Some of the doctors on board may have been there as part of the ship's medical personnel. Others may have been doctors who weren't traveling in any professional capacity, but just happened to be there. So, Veronica, we're going to look at two very interesting people. One of them is a legitimate doctor. The other one is not. So I always love looking at scoundrels. So are you ready to jump into this?
Yeah, actually, he was an optometrist, Dr. Morwak. He invented a tool for removing cataracts.
Okay, so he's legitimate in some ways, but that's what makes his period so interesting in the early 20th century, because what actually is medicine? The difference between being a quack and being a real doctor, it's not so much about how much you help people, but it's about what your credentialing is. So for all we know, Morwak may have had to pay a lot more careful attention to what he was doing and could have done more good to people or not. So we'll see. Let's jump in with Dr. Ernest Morwak. So I can't wait to hear his story. What's his background and what happened to him on the Titanic?
Well, and he actually might have thought he was helping people, but, in terms of those he was trying to help, like the young woman he was trying to hit on, she might have thought that he was a stalker more than anything. So I don't know if it definitely does not qualify, I don't think, for helping people, but he was very intent on trailing along behind second-class passenger Kate Buss, who was traveling alone. And Kate's letters have recently emerged and become printed in newspapers and so forth, Scott. So she's become a better known passenger. Years ago, no one really knew much about her. But we're starting to hear her name more and more among the more well-known survivors.
It sounds like he was trailing her. And I believe he's coming back from Europe at this time to America. Is that right?
Interestingly enough, he was on the Titanic. And the reason he was on the Titanic inspired the headline in the Indianapolis News that said, "No good fortune in the villa he inherited." He had inherited a villa, a very nice villa worth about $30,000, which was a fortune back in those days. It was in Germany, and he went to see it to find out what he could do with it so it didn't just sit there. He wanted to find a way to use it. He had somehow coerced a woman, Frau Hasse, to put him in her will. They weren't even married, but to get him in her will instead of her family members, and he inherited the family estate. So that's what inspired the headline, "No good fortune in the villa he inherited," because had he not gone over there to greedily find out what he could do with the place, he would not have been on the Titanic.
Well, he's definitely a very proficient con man. That's a biggest mark, wealthy widow, so he knows what he's doing. His invention, the tool to remove cataracts, when does he do this? Is this well before the Titanic or around this time?
Right. It's well before the Titanic. He developed a tool for removing cataracts. So he was, as I mentioned, he was a tried and true bona fide doctor. And he did seem to think that it was his role to look after women like Kate Buss, who were traveling alone. Kate had become friendly with Marion Wright, who was also traveling alone in second class. And on several occasions, they spent time with Dr. Morwak, although even when he offered to Kate Buss to show her around New York City when they got there, she declined.
And I know that Morwak was married earlier. Is he still married at this point and dabbling in a little extramarital or even possible bigamy? What's happening at this time?
He wasn't married at the time. His wife had passed away, but he had long ago established a string of situations where he would bilk lonely widows who seemed to have nobody who cared about them. He would bilk them out of their estates. It was more than once that he did this.
Okay, well, it sounds like he and Kate Buss are in kind of similar situations when the ship is going down. So what happens on that night with our doctor?
Well, that's where they part ways. He offers to help her, and we know very little of what happened to him after that point, but she declined his help and went off with another man that she had met on the ship, a young man who had been asked by someone to look after her, and another friend of theirs, Alfred Payne, and Marion Wright. And ironically, the four of them went off together. Alfred did not survive. Marion and Kate and their friend Sidney Collett was his name, and they did survive, but Sidney was relocating. All three of them were moving from England to the United States. What we do know is that Dr. Morwak was with the young ladies when they all attended an evening hymn service that night. And it was ad hoc. Someone had asked Lawrence Beasley, the journalist, if he would be willing to ask permission for some people to get together for an evening hymn service that Sunday night. They had already gone to church earlier in the day. There were church services, but they wanted to have an impromptu evening activity where they got together and had, as they called it, a hymn sing-song. And they did that in the dining saloon located on D deck, which of course was the saloon that was filled with mahogany furniture and upholstered in crimson. There were long tables in the room with swivel chairs, and they were bolted to the floor in case of rough seas. And there was a piano player that entertained diners during dinner. But this was in the evening, long after dinner, and it went on until just about bedtime. And they sang songs like For Those in Peril on the Sea. Later, they would look back and recall how ironic it was that so many of the songs that they sang, Dr. Morwak and the gals would sing with this group that were really, ironic considering the circumstances they were about to experience. One of them, Marion Wright, sang two solos. There is a green hill far away and Lead Kindly Light, which is actually the poem, The Pillar and the Cloud. That was written in 1833 by John Henry William, the Anglican vicar and theologian. And it was read to Queen Victoria as she passed away in 1901.
So we don't know what happened with Morwak, but he leaves behind something very interesting. His pattern of befriending widows and getting into their will emerges. So what comes out after he dies?
Yeah, he left behind an astonishing fortune, around $75,000. And, we can safely assume from the stories that we've heard of the other women that he was involved with, the different widows that he befriended, that's where a lot of that money came from. And the $75,000 fortune was left to his sister in Tell City, Indiana, Mrs. Claudina Coldway, and to his brother Elvin in New York City. Today, I think that amount would be roughly about $1.8 million.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that story because there are always swindlers in a group this large of people. And when you have the Titanic, which is a lot of wealthy people amassed together, you're going to have people on the periphery that are trying to bilk it. I don't know if Morwak, well, it sounds like he was working an angle the whole time, so he never stopped right up to the end. But, I don't think we'd be doing doctors a favor if Morwak was the only person we profiled for doctors. Wouldn't really be giving them too much credit or making it out like he's the poster boy for them. So let's look at someone else who is maybe a better example of the medical profession on the Titanic, and that's Henry Washington Dodge. So can you tell me about him and his background and what his experiences were?
I was drawn to Dr. Dodge in his story because he, number one, lived in one of my favorite cities ever, San Francisco, California, and because his wife, Ruth, saved her first-class luncheon menu from earlier that day, April 14th, earlier the day that the Titanic struck the iceberg. She had tucked it away in her purse uh, chicken type soup, like a chicken soup type soup called Cocky Leaky, kind of an old fashioned name for basic chicken soup, but made with egg yolks and prunes. That was on the menu that day. There was also corned beef, vegetables, dumplings, grilled mutton chops, and chicken a la Maryland. And they were in first class, Scott. So Morwak was in second class. This couple was in first. Chicken a la Maryland really, raised my curiosity, and everything I could find indicates that it's basically a fancy name for fried chicken. If anyone out there knows of something different than that, I'm all ears, but I really ran that one to ground, and it seemed like chicken was just a fancy name for fried chicken a la Maryland. And then there were 3 different types of potatoes. There was mashed, fried, and baked jacket potatoes in their skins. So the lunch also included a buffet of salmon mayonnaise, potted shrimps, Norwegian anchovies, soused herrings. There were plain and smoked herrings, roast beef, spiced beef. There were veal and ham pies. And then there were Virginia and Cumberland hams, bologna sausage, brawn, gelatin of chicken, which is like a not just a chicken breast, but it's made with a gelatinous substance, and it's more of a specialty type of chicken prepared. And there was a beer listed on the menu, a draft Munich lager beer, which, Scott, you and I have talked about this on other episodes, and it was made by Wrexham Lager, which was the beer provider for the Titanic.
Oh, shows up again.
Yes.
And for this doctor, we have a pretty good account of what happens because Dodge does manage to survive and talks about his experiences, and his are really interesting. So could you tell me about his experiences after the ship strikes the iceberg?
They're horrific experiences, Scott. In fact, he survives, but 7 years later, after he survives, he falls into an incredible depression. He suffers from anxiety. He ends up shooting himself in the elevator of his apartment building in San Francisco. On that night, he was said to experience hearing a lot of gun shooting, enough that he claimed there must have been a huge ruckus aboard the ship. This is while he was in the lifeboat. He had gotten into a lifeboat, and he said he heard as many as 50 shots fired, which was evidence that there must have been dreadful fighting going on board. The panic in steerage, he described that. And then he claimed that he saw First Officer Murdoch turn a gun on himself.
There's a quote of his where he talks about encountering or hearing the cries of people when he realizes that there are still survivors aboard.
He had already helped his wife and child into a lifeboat. And then he himself was able to get into one. And he was also in that lifeboat with him was Melvina Dean. And Melvina Dean passed away in 2009 as the only survivor at that point from the Titanic. She was the longest living survivor because she was an infant that night, and they were in the same lifeboat together. Later, he would go on to tell about his experiences, and here's a quote that was included in one of the newspapers at the time. He said, "Any impression which I had that there were no survivors aboard was speedily removed from my mind by the faint yet distinct cries which were wafted across the waters. Some there were in our boat who insisted that these cries came from occupants of the different lifeboats, which were nearer the scene of the wreck than we were, as they called one to another. To my ear, however, they had but one meaning, and the awful fact was borne in upon me that many lives were perishing in those icy waters. With the disappearance of the steamer, a great sense of loneliness and depression seemed to take possession of those in our boat."
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. So do you think that's what led to his personal depression? All the memory of what he saw and experienced on the last night that he carried with him?
I do. And, there was another survivor, a crew member, Ed Wheelton, who described something very different. And it kind of, I don't want to say anything negative about how Dr. Dodge managed his traumatic stress. But then there were people who were very positive in their descriptions of what happened. There was a steward. His name was Ed Wheelton, and he survived to testify during the U.S. Senate inquiry. And his description was very different than Dr. Dodge's. He spoke up for First Officer Morwak. He said to the Senate inquiries, and this was during a time when, nice things weren't being said about this man, and yet this young steward took it upon himself to speak up for him. He said, "I would like to say something about the bravery exhibited by First Officer Morwak. He was perfectly cool and very calm." And I thought that was really neat that he would, at a time like that, when he was being scrutinized, under oath, that he would stand up and say something very different from these other accounts of Morwak shooting himself. We'll never know for sure. We will never know. But we do know a lot from Ed Wheelton, from what he said, and also because he himself saved a menu. And Ed's menu was a crew menu for the lunch. We don't know which day it was, but it was one of the days, one of the lunches from one of the days. And it was handwritten. It was not printed out on the printing presses that were on board for the passenger menus. Ed had tucked it away, and years later he gave it to his niece. And eventually it ended up in the hands of one of her husband's employees. The main courses were fried sole. There was grilled cutlets, grilled chicken. There was a porterhouse steak, which is a thick cut of beef from the back part of the cow. There was petite maritime, they called it, which is lobster tail, and French fried potatoes. That's what the crew ate. And then there was a special dessert, which is very popular today, something we see very commonly today, but about 10, 20 years ago, we weren't seeing a whole lot of it. And it's rhubarb, Scott. There was stewed rhubarb and custard. Now, rhubarb is something I always love. I grew up with it, but it's just only recently become trendy. The first rhubarb that was planted in the United States is known to have been the rhubarb that was planted in Philadelphia by John Bartram. He was a Quaker who brought seeds and planted them in the 1730s. And his house and garden is available to go in and visit. The public can go there. And it's likely the spot where the first rhubarb grew in America. So while the rhubarb custard pie has been a long-standing custom in England, rhubarb has only been growing in the United States since the 1700s. England has embraced it long, long before, and very often in the form of like a pudding. They call them fools, Fool. They're like stewed fruit mixed with custard. And you can enjoy a strawberry fool. There's all sorts of different fruits or berries that are made into these little pudding desserts. And so for our culinary spotlight today, we have a rhubarb custard pie, which is basically custard and stewed fruit, like the Titanic crew would have eaten. And this recipe is for a large pie, but it can be adapted to make hand pies or individual tarts. You can make small little rhubarb tarts for passable desserts for a party or something like that, if you want to do a Titanic themed party, which I think is a really nice idea in honor of the crew. It's just basically rhubarb, eggs, milk, flour, sugar. The recipe calls for a store-bought pie crust because it's a lot easier than making your own pie crust and tastes just as good. So it's a really nice time saver to just go and buy your pie crust. And what I like to do is to split those in half, because you get a much thinner pastry crust then, and the thinner, the crispier.
Rhubarb, and I think too, as what its story is, where it has its origins in Asia, and then it comes to England, then it comes to America, this global movement of this plant. It's interesting because it's similar to sort of the global movement in the maritime life of people who would work in Europe, work around the world, these different types of foods and cultures circulating all throughout the place. Rhubarb is really a good example of that.
Yeah, I agree. I loved it when I found that in my research, that rhubarb was aboard the Titanic and eaten aboard Titanic, because it's just such a neat ingredient, and I just love to celebrate it. We're seeing it now in everything from cocktails to muffins to you name it. And so I think it's neat to see that it was on the menus aboard the Titanic.
Well, this, like all the other recipes that were featured in our culinary spotlights, can be found on the show notes. This recipe spotlight is available in detail, as are all the other ones in all the other episodes. So you can find them all there. Thanks for listening to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast. To listen to all the episodes in the series, go to lastnightonthetitanicpodcast.com. There you'll also find show notes, biographical profiles of the passengers and crew on the Titanic, and recipes for all the recipe spotlights that we do in the series. One last thing, if you like the show, please rate and review it on the podcast listener of your choice. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.